Um, Good evening, everyone. Buenas noches. My name is John Gutiérrez, and I'm director of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies. I'm delighted to welcome you to the CUNY Graduate Center for what I know will be an interesting and urgent discussion about the situation in Peru. Before diving into tonight's event, I want to offer my thanks and appreciation to my colleagues at the CLACLS for their work in making sure that this event happened. I especially want to recognize Dr. Andreina Torres Angarita, who as one of our two postdoctoral fellows, ensures that we have the space and the technical tools to host events such as these. I also want to thank my colleagues Kathy Cabrera Figueroa and Diomel Carribas for their assistance in making this evening a success, and for taking time from their own work to join us tonight. We're joined this evening by 4 experts in Peruvian studies who have agreed to come and share their insights about the events that have taken place since December, when President Pedro Castillo's government came to an end under circumstances that, while unfortunate, were not, by the standards of recent Peruvian political history, altogether surprising. For more than 20 years, José Rénique was a professor of Latin American history at Lehman College and here at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is the author of La Batalla por Puno, Conflicto Agrario y Nación en los Andes Peruanos, Incendiar la Pradera, un ensayo sobre la revolución en el Perú, and finally, La Nación Radical, de la utopía indigenista a la tragedia senderista. Mark Rice is an associate professor of history at Baruch College. He studies the history of the Andean region with a particular focus on Peru. His most recent book was published by the University of North Carolina Press and is titled Making Machu Picchu, The Politics of Tourism in 20th Century Peru. He received his Ph.D. at Stony Brook University, and his research on Latin American history and tourism has appeared in the Radical History Review, the Journal of Latin American Studies, Apuntes, Revista de Ciencias Sociales, among others. Renzo Aroni is a Quechua scholar, self-taught musician, and historian of modern Latin America with a focus on 20th and 21st century Peru. He is currently a Mellon postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at Columbia University. He received his PhD in history with dual emphases in human rights and Native American studies from UC Davis, and he is completing his manuscript, Indigenous Peasants at War, Resistance and Massacre in Peru's Shining Path. Finally, Myriam Nacimento is a PhD student in cultural anthropology here at the Graduate Center. Her research interests include the history of coca in the Andes, post-human anthropology, and critical agrarian studies. We're especially happy that Miryam is able to join us from Lima this evening. Okay. Finally, let me close by sharing an anecdote about the relationship between the CLACLS and Peru. A little over 20 years ago, our executive director, Professor Laird Burgad, and I welcomed former President Alejandro Toledo to the Graduate Center. As Jose Luis well remembers, because he was essential in helping that event take place here in the heart of New York City. There was a feeling of excitement that night as throngs of Peruvians waited to greet and hear from the new president. It really was a moment when it seemed that a new Peru was, in a word, posible. It isn't lost on me and anyone else who was here that night that 20 years later, the hopefulness of that evening has been overshadowed by instability, violence, corruption, and a powerful counterpoint of hopelessness. I hope that our guest tonight will be able to shed some light on the road that has led us from then to now. A word about the organization of tonight's event. We will begin by getting an update on the current state of affairs in Peru with a remote presentation from Myriam Nacimento. Next, we'll turn to Professor Rénique to help us understand the historical origins and contours of the anti-government protest in southern Peru particularly. And then finally, we'll ask Professors Rice and Aroni to offer their observations of the current crisis from their own disciplinary backgrounds. After our colleagues have completed their presentations, we'll open the floor to you for what I hope will be a lively and informative question and answer session. Thank you very much for being here. Myriam, the floor is yours.
Hi, greetings from Lima, Peru. And thanks to the Latin American Center for Latin American Studies for the invitation. In my presentation, I want to focus on the protests and how the protests have been experiencing how protesters have been experiencing the repression coming from the government in the past 2 months. I'm sure other panelists will offer prolific interpretations about the historical background of what is happening. So I will concentrate more on the humanitarian crisis that is going on in the country, a crisis that many even said was heading to a humanitarian crisis. So I want to start saying that it's very difficult to exaggerate the magnitude of the violence that protesters have been experiencing over the past 2 months. Since December, we have 67 deaths, and there is no single politician or police agent who has taken any kind of responsibility for these deaths, which reflects, I would say, a total breakdown of the democratic consensus in Peru. Around 1,200 people have been injured, and we could say that this kind of social unrest is a trend in the region because over the last decade, similar strikes have been taking place in different countries in Latin America. We saw this happening in Ecuador. We saw this happening in Chile. We saw this happening in Colombia in 2021. I was in Colombia doing field work when this happened. And definitely there are similarities. For example, in all the cases, there was this vandalistic component. Also, in all the cases, the state responded with violence, which made things worse. But I would say that both Colombia and Peru are the worst cases where the magnitude of the violence was worse. And this, I would say, is because of the number of killings, which surpass the number of killings in other neighbor countries. And with respect to that, I want to share a piece of information. According to the NGO Civicus, 24 people died in the world in the last year in the context of protests and manifestations. But in Peru, we have more than 60 deaths only in 60 days of government. So I think this shows the magnitude of the crisis in Peru. Also, in following the action and the performance of the national police, different human rights organizations have argued that the government response has been excessive, indiscriminate, and widespread. And these human rights organizations say that there is a pattern of action that can be described as systematic police brutality. And now I want to mention different instances or pieces of evidence that demonstrate this brutality. And the first one and the main evidence are the ballistic reports and the necropsies of the victims that were killed during the protest. Necropsies have found bullets of military firearms like rifles and pistols in the victims' bodies. This means that the police are using high-velocity weapons classified as weapons of war to repress the manifestations. The bodies of the people that were killed have entry and exit holes, mainly in the thorax and the head, and in several cases, the bullets entered through the back. Also, the police do not respect the guidelines to use tear gas, and because of that, one person was killed by a tear gas in Lima. Dina Boluarte right now is transferring more money to the Ministry of Defense to purchase ammunition, and I think countries should consider conditioning the sale of military equipment to Peru because it's important for you to know that it is being used to violate human rights. Another instance of police brutality have been the 3 massacres which took place in Ayacucho, Andahuaylas, and Puno between December and January. In these 3 regions, protesters attempted to take airports, and the military and the police responded with gunfire. And here I want to underscore that the attacks on the population were indiscriminate. They were basically directed at whomever they hit. The shooting continued even as the demonstrators fled. That day, for example, Edgar Prado left his house to help a wounded man, and he was hit by 2 shots. Like many others who died, he was not even participating in the protest. We also have underage people and journalists who have been targeted. Also, I want to highlight the fact that this happened in Ayacucho, Andahuaylas, and Puno, and not in Lima, which means that the government repression is particularly targeted to racialized people like indigenous and peasant populations. In other words, The repression will be harder if you speak Quechua and if you are originally from the Andes, which reflects the systematic racism that guides the government repression. Another example of the excessive repression is the arbitrary detentions, like the one that happened at Universidad San Marcos. On January 21st, the military entered in San Marcos with tanks and helicopters, and that single day, almost 200 people were arrested. People were detained, humiliated, degraded. They also were insulted while they were forced to lie on the floor. And also among the people arrested, there was a pregnant woman, an 8-year-old girl, and an older adult. Lawyers were not allowed to enter, and people arrested were allowed to leave only 24 hours later. And many of them were accused of apology for terrorism. Also, women that were arrested that day report that they were victims of sexual abuse by the police that molested them while being under arrest. And here I want to say that the state of emergency is what makes it easier for the government to arrest protesters. Also, another dimension of police repression is the state persecution of collective action. The government is instilling terror in the population so that they prevent people to take action and protest. And one example of this is that the police has opened a hotline for people to denounce potential terrucos or terrorists, even if they are not members of the Shining Paths. And here the slide shows the tweet that was published by the Ministry of Interior, in which they announced the opening of this hotline. So this shows that the state persecution is evolving, is definitely becoming more sophisticated, and repression, I would say, is changing its forms. People are being encouraged to denounce the crime of apology to terrorism. And I would say that this happens in the context of this strong legacy of anti-politics in Peru. Basically, any demand that is political is seen as manipulated. According to the government, you can only protest for social services like water, food, or infrastructure, but you can't protest to make changes in the political system. For example, if you decide to organize to demand a new constitution, you can be accused of terrorism. In other words, changing the political system is not seen as a legitimate demand by the government at this moment. And that is why, since the beginning of the crisis, we saw the police raiding the houses where people from the regions were staying when they came to Lima. That happened in December. In December, the police raided the premises of the Confederación Campesina del Perú in Lima, which is a peasant organization. Now, we also know that the government is tracking donations and restricting them. There is persecution to ollas comunes, which are these small local organizations that pool their money to buy food for everyone. People have been arrested because of collecting money to help wounded people. And they have been arrested for that. And with respect to that, I want to say something about how protesters are financing the mobilization, because many, especially in Lima, ask, how are protesters financing the mobilization for so long? And I just want to say that first, there is no evidence that Bolivia is financing the protests, because that was another narrative from the far right. They say that Evo Morales is behind these mobilizations. They also say that the Shining Path is behind the mobilizations. Well, there is no evidence of that. That is misinformation. And I think misinformation is another component of the political crisis in which in Peru is making things worse. I wanted to underscore that protesters are supporting themselves through ancient forms of community organization and solidarity. For example, there is the rotation of people in the communities. Some people return home and others go to the protests and organize. There are also ollas comunes. People are sharing resources, they are sharing money, and that is how people are sustaining the protests. There are also many students that are joining. They are joining as volunteers to administer donations. And yes, at this point, people are exhausted because it's been more than 2 months and nothing has changed. Dina Boluarte won't renounce. However, I would say that at this point, mobilizations are still going on, but I would say they are mostly concentrated in the south at this moment, especially in Puno. Some days ago, the government installed a unified command of the armed forces and the national police in Puno to maintain the order, something that didn't happen since the internal conflict in the 80s. And although in other parts of the country, people have stopped mobilizing, in Puno, people are still blocking roads and organizing every day. And I would say that that is something particular from Puno, is that mobilizations are still going on. And also that another important characteristic that is happening in Puno is that all sectors are participating. We see Quechuas, we see Aymaras, we see people from the city, we see people from rural areas. Mobilization intersects also all social sectors in Puno, which I think is something particularly relevant from Puno. Finally, I really didn't want to finish without sharing with you a public statement that a group of Peruvian students and scholars have prepared over the past weeks. We got together to discuss what we could do, and some wrote this declaration. In this slide, I'm sharing with you the QR so that you can use your phones and download the text. And it would really help us a lot if you could sign it. This text has been written by the network of Peruvian students and scholars in North America, which is the Red de Estudiantes Peruanos en North America, REPAN. And in this declaration, we basically condemn the escalation of violence in Peru, and we ask other academics to join by signing the statement. We ask you to help us spread the message through your academic networks. The European Union, the United Nations, and several human rights organizations have already expressed their concern for what is happening in Peru. And it would really help us a lot if you could sign. I just wanted to share that. And that's all from my part.
Myriam, thank you very much. We appreciate your presentation and taking time to talk to us from Lima tonight. We're going to move on to our next presenter, and that is Professor José Luis Rénique. See if we can get this up on the screen. No, up one. There you go. Yeah, that's it.
Sorry, you're gonna stop.
Yes. ¿Cómo la paso?
Aquí. Aquí.
Listo, gracias. Good evening. Thank you for the invitation, John. Tonight, I would like to present some ideas that hopefully would give you a mental path to access the current Peruvian scenario through the case of Puno, which, as you know, has become the epicenter of social convulsion in Peru. And let's begin. The way in which I have put together this PowerPoint is that there are 5 parts, as I said, and which is each one of them reflect my rationale. And then I have included some illustrations with the purpose of making this more interesting, that we maybe can trigger some conversation later. The basic question. I decided to put these 4 images to remember, or the purpose of this section is basically to make 3 points. The first one is that I am a foreign observer. I'm from Lima. So, and I think it is so interesting that Renzo is here, so he's for sure going to present a very different view, or a different view. So I have three objectives in this first section. The first one is establishing my point of observation as an external observer. What do you see there? And this is closely linked to the basic question I was talking about. Here you have the empresas asociativas created by Velasco's agrarian reform being swept by Shining Path. Here you have the federations in the northern part of Puno organizing themselves to dismantle what remains of these rural enterprises. And but they were fighting against Shining Path, because they didn't want Shining Path to overimpose itself upon their movement. And this is the face of that counterinsurgency had by that time, which is entering into the countryside through the formation of bases contrasubversivas. So, in few words, the peasants were fighting a triple front struggle against Shining Path, against the agrarian reform, and against the government to stop militarization, which in the language of the time was to have another Ayacucho. Because by 1987, Ayacucho had been subjected to some of the most brutal repression during the period of the internal conflict. Oops. No pasa. ¿A dónde apunto?
Funcionó antes, ¿no?
¿Sí? ¿Lo abrí aquí? Tampoco. Uy.
A veces la tecnología no coopera.
Qué pena.
Qué raro. Oh, because I moved this. No, because we have to be in the Zoom. Claro. Oh.
Ya. ¿Ok? So, yo creo que hay una previa. ¿Cuál es la...?
No, con esto.
¿Sí? A ver. Ok, sí. So the question that came up into my mind by that time in witnessing this complex operation was what kind of political culture is the one that sustained this collective effort? I mean, where they learn to be so tactful politically, manage to create a mobilization, etc., etc. That's the big question. This is a story that took me many years to put together in this book that had 2 editions, and in which the subtitle was Conflicto Agrario y Nación en los Andes Peruanos, which convey my need to connect the local and the national, because I wanted to offer a perspective of the Peruvian political system from the borders, from a rural society, instead of just doing the classical elite-oriented political analysis of the evolution of the Peruvian Republic. Now, as I said, the second point is to understand that Puno is special within the Peruvian Andes and probably in the whole Andean area for several reasons. It has access to the Amazonian region, it has access to high mountain, but the most important part of Puno is the high plateau, the altiplano, which have enormous influence in shaping human connectivity, commercial development, contact, etc., etc. And this is something that you must keep in the back of your mind as something that probably there are many, many possibilities that doesn't happen in the properly mountainous part of the rest of the country, where contact among populated settlements, human settlements is more complicated by geography and so on. And so this is a high plateau, which is actually an altiplano. And the point is that historically, the altiplano, despite of its dryness, etc., and the remoteness, became very important because it was an apt place for camelic breeding. And that's why it occupied a central role in the colonial economy. However, by the late 18th century, with the mining crisis and many other factors that we cannot go into at this point, it became a place that was separated from a larger geographical region that goes all the way to northern Argentina, obviously Bolivia, and part of Chile. And the most important thing is that for anybody who wanted to subject the Altiplano to a wider scheme of exploitation, they needed to have as a point of departure the fact that the camelids needed to be taken care of by communities, because it's a highly specialized kind of work, right? And that put upon the pastores a strong physical demand, so some sort of indirect form of exploitation needed to be in place, right? So the point that I am making is that this is the constant in the history of the Altiplano, right? Look at those figures, and this made me think that actually the main topic of the history of Puno is the problem of subordinating peasant communities. And that process was completed fundamentally between those two dates, because if the independence of Peru was in 1821, for the first half a century or less than half a century, the Peruvian state was not strong enough and the hacendados were not strong enough to impose their exploitation, their domination upon the communities. And actually, the turning point is going to be, one methodological point. What I needed to do in this section is to read the so-called list of Indian rebellions, which are part of the official history of Peru against the grain. And if you do so, you will discover that although these rebellions, as is the case, are usually identified with their external leaders, actually they were the work of a grassroots movement that was already in the making in the defense of the community. This rebellion had some features that are very important. First of all, Juan Bustamante was a rich merchant of wool. Secondly, he was a liberal who actually wanted to bring the goodies of independence up to the highlands, because, as he said, Peru was not a nation after 50 years of independence, precisely because we haven't been able to bring that, to climb with independence to the highlands. And the third important factor is that he created a network of support that allowed him to bring Indian delegations to Lima, to talk to authorities, to go to newspapers, offices, in order to present the case of the peasants. And the final point is the way in which Bustamante and the whole leadership of the rebellions were killed, were assassinated. They were imprisoned in a public building, in a school in the town of Pusi in Lampa, and they were set afire. Right. This operation is a turning point in this history because it allows us to see how the breaking of the resistance of the peasant communities opened the way for the creation of a complex mechanism that, with the support of British capital, allow even the construction of a railroad, the extraction of wool from Altiplano, which is going to be conducted all the way to Manchester. Right. And so the system that was created to make possible this exploitation feature three kind of mistis, that is mestizos or so-called whites in the context of the Altiplano, who played a fundamental role in making this possible. The hacendados that extended their lands, their control of pastures and other resources, making the peasant communities dependent, excuse me, the brutality and the despotism of the gamonales, who were the individuals who perform a whole privatization of the state, because they were public officers who actually became merchants of all, who supported the hacendados and were a pivotal force in the creation of a regional elite that organized this system of exploitation, and indigenistas, who were friends of the Indians, who every once in a while created a situation in which they can bring an authority that was actually benevolent with the natives and so on, okay? These pictures, I think, show what was actually the response from the grassroots to this, the imposition of the system. Here you have the Puneño messengers, los mensajeros del Altiplano, which is the constant sending of delegation after delegation to fight back the gamonales. We are talking about the Peruvian or the Andean version of servitude, actually. This is imposition of servitude through the gamonales, something that obviously was rejected by liberals and nationalists, people such as, for instance, Teodomiro Cuevas Gutiérrez, an officer who was a sub-prefect of Chucuito, who received the mensajeros in Lima and who took them to talk to the President of the Republic, okay? So what I am saying is that at the moment when the subordination of the communities was happening, if we read things against the grain, we can see that this was a fundamental period for the communities to learn about the mechanisms of the political system and how to act on it, right? This is probably, yes, definitely the peak of this kind of approach, because it's a moment when President Augusto L, probably the most pro-Yankee president we have had in our history, maybe together with Toledo, Leguía was a modernizer, so he toppled down the most traditional sector of the oligarchy, and he issued a constitution that included the legal acknowledgement, recognition, the legal recognition of communities, right? However, despite of the fact of all this demagoguery and this populist style, when he fulfilled his own personal political agenda, he turned against the Indian movement and basically repressed it again in 1923. For those who are familiar with the work of Alberto Flores Galindo, we could say that this is the last time that the grassroots movement played the card of Utopia Andina, of the Andean utopia, right? Basically, they were erased and the movement went underground, but for the regional elites, it was a Pyrrhic victory. And I have chosen these two pictures, having in mind what is going on with fiesta and songs in carnavales today in Peru, which has been transformed in anti-government expressions. These are pictures taken in the late 1930s that clearly demonstrate how the comuneros were displaying their criticism to, or their treatment of the colonial memoirs, right, in their own way, an interpretation of the devil, and they're mocking out the authorities of colonial times, right? And this allows me to say that this is going to be a period that within the framework of subalternism, the local communities learn to deal with the political system. They learn the new role that had been granted by the Republic, and they learn how to push it and amplify it, right? This is a time when the knowledge of the presidentes comuneros and the leaders of communities, probably, I'm sure Renzo is going to talk more about that, was actually consolidated, okay? Now, if you see the dates, you would see that this operation of modernizing domination happened in the midst of the Cold War. A new language was needed. Anthropologists appeared in the horizon, such as François Bourricot, the most notable of them in my view, and Luis Valcárcel, the former indigenista of the 1920s, had a lot of influence. He was Minister of Education. There were programs of bilingual education, etc. And if you see the title of that publication of the regional government of Puno, you would see what kind of new language was being coined with the purpose of granting the subaltern situation of the region. This image is about one of the responses of the communities. There was a family, a political family of merchants in Juliaca. Later, I will make a point about the city of Juliaca, who were the Cáceres, who were nicknamed the Kennedys of El Altiplano. Okay, so that can give you, they were a progressive sector of the bourgeoisie that organized a network of communities. And on top of what I was saying before about the learning of communities, this is a period in which there were peasant mayors, there were peasant authorities, the money for small public works was available, and through the presence of the Cáceres brothers in Congress, communities managed to get part of the pie for first time in a systematic way. So the interesting thing is how, you see, if you keep in mind my point about the political learning of the communities that I made in section number 1, this is going to be another layer of that learning. However, when that kind of leadership was not enough, the communities rise up, and there were confrontations that left people killed. So what I am saying is that the presence of this grassroots movement was quite evident, despite of the fact that the facade of a social, of a Christian democratic movement, because the Cáceres were the leaders of that affiliation, were part of that affiliation, is the external face of the movement. So then, and this is maybe a disconcerting point, I would say that Velasco was part of this period. There were continuities between the parliamentary democracy that lasted between 1948 to 1968. 1948 to 1956, we have dictatorship, Oderia, and from 1956 to 1968, we have democracy with Belaunde, Prado and Belaunde. There is a long continuity because actually the counterinsurgent perspective of the military prevailed in the way in which the agrarian reform was put together, above all in a region such as Puno that was considered to be geopolitically crucial because of the vicinity with Bolivia, and because they feel that Puno was so threatening and that keeping the productivity of the wool trade was fundamental. So after 8 years from the agrarian reform, the movement was going on once again, fighting for land, right? The military withdrawal withdrew in 1980, leaving behind a new constitution, which most prominent change was introducing vote for illiterate people. So going back to my idea of political learning of the communities, as you can see, then a new layer was added. And at this time, I need to make a reflection. Once the alternative of ethnic citizenship that was at stake in the 1920s was shut down when Leguía turned against the peasant movement in 1923, the Altiplano, that had so far been the second department in population in Peru, started to find an alternative path, which was migration, focus on education, right? That is, in few words, not anymore the collective path, but the individual one, right? And this is indeed a fundamental aspect in the making of this radical politics of the southern regions of Peru I am talking about here. Now, point number 4, as you can see, for the dates coincide with the era of Fujimori, and in very general terms, I call this period an emerging new context. What I am basically doing is what neoliberalism meant for Puno, and it meant the conclusion of a process. You can follow it, seeing the waste, the population of Juliaca from 6,000 in 1940 to close to 280,000 in 2020. That is the phenomena of a major peasant metropolis, right? That serve multiple purposes, from jobs to bureaucratic resolutions, education, etc. It was a tool. Whatever you can say, whatever the other specialists could say, Juliaca became a tool for the communities, right? And then thousands of Puneños began to go down to the Amazonian area of the department, looking for cash, looking for seasonal migration, opportunities to reinforce their languishing peasant economies, with cash coming from lavaderos de oro in the province of Sandia. And the best example of these trends of the time of Fujimori is the making of La Rinconada in Carabaya, an absolute phenomenon, and what is this called? National Geographic ran an article with impressive pictures. These two come from there, in which you can see 30,000 people, most of them coming from the Altiplano, basically scratching the land by the Ananea Peak, looking for gold nuggets, basically, right? And obviously, contrabando and narcotráfico, smuggling and narco-traffickers. Once again, the topic of geography. Through the lake, through the Altiplano, this is La Culebra, which is the nickname given to contraband activities in Puno. How it is disorganized? You put together 100, 150 trucks and consider the Peruvian state. Imagine who is going to stop La Culebra to check if they are carrying contrabando from Bolivia, right? And another point, the Punenización of the South, right? I said before that Puno was, by the 1950s, the second department in population in Peru. Now, at this point, it's in 9th. But where the Puneños are? The Puneños are in Arequipa, in Moquegua, in Tacna, right? Bringing or in a connection that is never fundamentally broken, right? And this exchange of population is going to have a fundamental role in the making of this radical politics. So what conclusions we can draw from this? Let's give a look to 1990 and 2023. I mean, what politics corresponded to this crazy situation of growth, economic growth without institutional development, and with this situation in which Peru was becoming a big informal republic, right? In which more than 70% of the internal brute production comes from so-called illegal activities of the black economy, if you want. And what kind of politics was possible by that time? There were no parties, it was a democracia sin partidos. And in this context, the grassroots movement was fundamentally fragmented. And there were people coming up with versions of what is the Aymara identity, others who defended the Quechua identity. Communities were making non-Santos alliances, and because Puno had been in the opposition against the Fujimori regime, and you just need to look at the electoral results of the 1990s to prove that. For instance, in the referendum or about the Constitution of 1993, Puno was the only department in which the no won. Okay, so Puno was a target of personalist politics of Fujimori. He used to, I have an anecdote. One day I was interviewing the regional coordinator who had replaced the presidents of the region, or the regional presidents. And somebody entered to the office to let the president know that Fujimori was in Asanga, one of the provinces of the department. And he turned to me and told me, you see, nobody told me that the president is in Puno, right? And I was present in one of those surprise visits of Fujimori, and literally he handed down money to the local people, right? That was his style of politics. So all these mechanisms, together with the dirty tricks played by Montesinos, which consisted of cooptation, buying up leaders, and so on, contributed to the fragmentation of the grassroots movements. And probably the most extraordinary expression of this sort of anomia, I would say, is this incident that happened in Ilave, one of the most interesting commercial cities in the Aymara heartland, in which a problem related to the division of resources coming from the canon minero that was supposed to be distributed by the provincial mayor ended up in the communities, converging in the city of Ilave and taking the mayor and lynching him. This was informed by the Lima press, of course, as an expression of barbarity, and in a way, the Aymara movement was entering in the pages of the official political history of the country as a group that was potentially inclined to violence and to vandalism. But most important than that one was the so-called Aymarazo. And when you read, I'm not going into the details, I just wanted to say that when you read the details of the Aymarazo of 2011, it's like a general rehearsal of what you can see in Puno as we speak. The city of Puno was taken by the movement. The roads were blocked. Then a delegation was sent to Lima. Then they tried to take over the airport, and 6 or 7 people were killed, and so on. It was in this context when an event that was experienced from the perspective of Puno as the crowning of a long process that I have tried to describe here. Pedro Castillo was elected, and the figures are absolutely astonishing because Castillo won in every single district, not just provinces, districts of Puno, sometimes with a vote higher than 70, 80, 90%. And this is going to incite from the groups in Lima to put together a pool of famous lawyers to question the results of Puno and other parts of the South, because they say it is impossible that you can win in such a way, right? And some of the proofs that they offer were absolutely ridiculous, such as, for instance, look, in this electoral table, they all have the same last name, or half of them have the same last name, without understanding basic characteristics of the social patterns prevailing in some of these districts. This is going to be one of the triggering factors, of course, of the current situation. I just would like to end up with what I could call the profiling of a new political actor here. I was in the midst of the pandemic. I was trying to put together this volume that was a synthesis of my work of many years in the Southern Andes, and that was also in the midst of the celebration of the bicentenary of the Costeño Republic, let's put it in that way, and I decided to incur in a sort of provocation, in the sense that I didn't think that concepts such as exclusion, inequality were enough to portray this actor that I was seeing coming up, and I chose the name La Nación Radical to emphasize the fact that only by looking at the evolution of the Peruvian political system you can perceive a fact that, paraphrasing historian Steve Stern, was growing within and against the Peruvian Republic, right? To create a movement that, and this is the political debate of today, in my view, offer the possibility to socially and politically expand and strengthen the Peruvian Republic, but evidently from other perspectives is seen basically as an attack on law and order sustained by the authorities of Lima. Thank you very much.
So, Mark, and then Renzo, some reflections from you before we go to the audience.
Okay, well, you can hear me, right? Okay.
We can, yeah.
All right, well, if Professor Rénique is bringing the a foreign viewpoint to Puno, I guess I'm the perspectiva extraterrestre. But actually, maybe if you pardon me, especially if you're a Peruvianist, Peruvian expert, maybe I would actually like to step back, because maybe some of us are Latin Americanists, and maybe step back a little bit to and I'll give a little bit of perspective. Two questions, basically, why the anger and the kind of the explosion of nationwide anger, which is occurring kind of this year in the past few months, because Peruvian governments in the past 20 years have been all pretty universally unpopular, but they weren't accompanied by nationwide type sustained protests like this. So why this sustained anger, and why, as Myriam Nacimento has detailed quite well, the violence and the inability to kind of respond to this, right? So, and I welcome, this is the Mark Rice kind of take on this, and that doesn't mean it's the only one, so I would actually like to hear my panelists and people from the audience, please, you can, I'd like to hear other interpretations, but I think the real origins of this anger really do stem, as Professor Rénique, mentioned, in the 2021 elections, right, which Peruvian politics, which really had been eviscerated from political parties and institutions, as well as COVID, basically you had elections which were almost a free-for-all of established, unpopular, unknown candidates. And the two I mean, Peru has runoffs. So basically the two leading candidates after the first round was Keiko Fujimori, a longtime kind of political actor and kind of the inheritor of her father's kind of authoritarian political movement, and a relatively unknown Pedro Castillo, a teacher union head who had kind of been chosen as a figurehead of a political party, Peru Libre, but he himself wasn't really in the party for that long. And so this runoff took place, and during the runoff, which was close, but not the closest election, which is kind of key, Pedro Castillo defeated Keiko Fujimori by about 44,000 votes. But as Professor Rénique detailed, probably taking a page out of the Trump playbook, Keiko Fujimori and her allies kind of basically announced voter fraud in a way that had not been seen before, and quite tellingly was not really sustained in the previous election, which she lost to a white Peruvian named Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. In that election, the margin was actually smaller, but the claims of fraud weren't as strong, which clearly, right, and understandably wasn't justifiably interpreted as racism against the fact that these votes in the Andes don't count, right? They're not valid. And that really left kind of this really stinging sensation. So as the Castillo government kind of went through, basically Castillo and Congress, which was kind of dominated by the right wing, they kind of entered a certain Faustian bargain for most of his government, which was basically the Peruvian Constitution gives the executive and the Congress kind of an equal, unique ability to blow each other up. Basically, they can dissolve each other rather easily. And these two institutions basically entered into a Faustian instability to stay in power together, mainly so they didn't go to prison and to steal, basically. And when this when this bargain kind of began to crumble, Castillo, unconstitutionally sought to dissolve Congress. Now, Congress was right in impeaching him because he did, it sounds like a kid's argument, he hit me first, but it's true. And Congress in many ways was correct to impeach him, but Congress was even more unpopular than Castillo, and understandably, the people that were kind of voted for Castillo in the second round, because so many of the people in Congress were dominated by the same people that said votes don't count, right, that used this terribly racist language, understandably had no confidence in Congress ruling along with the replacement, Dina Boluarte, to kind of, to sustain and represent them. And this, I think, is the real reason for the anger. There's lots of reasons, but I think the immediate thing is this really terrible legacy from these fraud allegations from the 2021 election, which, basically gave people in many parts of Peru no confidence that, this Congress and this political coalition that kind of was left after Castillo would represent them in any way democratically. So I think that is, and people can refute that, but that's why I think you see the sustained anger that you didn't see in previous protests. And now why kind of the inability to resolve this? And I'm going to really borrow an interpretation that the political scientist Alberto Vergara, who I recommend if you want to get a good sense of Peruvian politics, he often has a very good way of interpreting it, and he publishes a lot in papers. And he recently, in a very good anthology, which just was published, called La Condena de la Libertad, which Professor Rénique also has a chapter in. It's a very good synthesis of Republican Peru. He described what had kind of occurred in Peru in the past 20 years. And he kind of argued, and I agree with him, that Peruvian institutions, which were never democratic in many ways, sometimes they were democratic, but never had a long consistency of being democratic, there was a sense that institutions, be they the armed forces, political parties, labor unions, represented interests, right? Maybe not always democratically, but they represented, certain groups, regions, interests. And in the wake of Fujimori's kind of technocratic kind of government, that governing agreement had changed dramatically, in which now institutions in Peruvian governments didn't represent, they exist to govern. And they exist to govern for macroeconomic growth, for stability. And in many ways, they did that quite well. In the past 20 years, Peru macroeconomically was doing well. You had massive reductions in extreme poverty, big successes in delivering growth. But it was a growth in which, because it was always existed to govern, not to represent, Peruvians never felt part of, they never felt represented by this. And as a result, what's left of it, as we're seeing today, is the current government exists to simply poner orden, right? To put order. But there's no put order for what? I mean, Peru has had authoritarian moments in the past, and I don't want to sound nostalgic for them, but even authoritarian moments in the past of Peru existed. This authoritarianism was justified to achieve a certain political project. Even Fujimori kind of, said, well, we're doing this to achieve this sort of political project. Velasco before him, even Odría and Benavides, right? There was a poner orden, but there was also a political result that was supposed to come to that. And the fact that now is basically we're putting order for the sake of order means that there's no buy-in from Peruvians to sustain this. And I think that's why we're kind of seeing the end of this kind of institutional rope in Peru, is that we've shifted from a government that was always flawed, but that did exist to represent, to now only exists to put order. And that's not a political project you can buy into. And I think unless we somehow find a way to start thinking of how we can create institutions in Peru that represent rather than solely govern, it's hard to see a long-term solution out of this crisis. And I'll just leave it there so we can hear other comments. But that's just my 2 cents or 2 soles of input.
Thanks, Mark. Renzo, we've been waiting for you.
Okay. Well, I didn't bring slides like Jose Luis. That was so good. But I prepared something that I have been thinking about. What John asked me, if I could talk about the ongoing state violence against the indigenous populations of the southern Andes of Peru from a historical perspective. Well, thank you so much again for the invitations. And I'm going to start saying that the social and political crisis that Peru is experiencing today has long-standing roots. So I will highlight some ideas to contextualize the protest in southern Peru, particularly how the state rules the historically marginalized sectors through politics of abandonment, postponement, brutal repressions, and rampant anti-indigenous racism. First, I should say that the most marginalized regions of Peru, such as Apurímac, Ayacucho, Huancavelica, and Puno, whose populations, primarily indigenous Quechua and Aymara people, has historically been subject to ethnic, racial, and violent discriminations and unequal access to political participations. The Peruvian state relegated these regions to prolonged structural violence, aggravated even more in the last 3 decades by neoliberal policies that have increased social disparities and all types of land concessions and dispossessions that caused violent socio-environmental conflicts because of mining extractivism, as we have been seeing one of the pictures that Jose Luis showed us from Puno. Such neoliberal policies try to alleviate the precarious living conditions of rural, poor, indigenous peasants by implementing social programs and infrastructure, but ultimately perpetuated poverty and state charity. Particularly, extreme poverty has been worsening in the last few years, adding to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been dramatic due to collapse of the healthcare system and the state corruption. And as a result, Peru suffered the highest coronavirus mortality rate in the world. The pandemic exposed the failure of the 3 decades of the neoliberal economic system and the failure of the government to remedy the popular demands for social justice with equal access to the healthcare system, better educations, and equal distribution of wealth that mainly benefited the upper class and business elites. At the same time, Quechua and Aymara people of the southern Peruvian Andes are tired of this clientelist social assistance-based policy, what we say in Spanish like asistencialismo. Right? So every government implemented this kind of policy in the last decades, and sometimes I think accused of corruption and clientelism, etc. What we see today is something different. What we see today is in the protest is the struggle for political rights, a demand for significant structural change to fully enjoy their citizenship. These political rights for indigenous people has been either denied or postponed historically. For instance, in reiterated speech, President Dina Boluarte said she will not discuss a political agenda with protesters, only social issues concerning people's basic needs. Instead of recognizing indigenous peoples as new competing grassroots political actors, the government and traditional conservative elites have linked them with backwardness, ignorance, and potential for chaos and violence. These privileged sect elites, mainly based in Lima, have seen indigenous people as obstacles to progress and modernity. But they denied indigenous people's struggle for modern citizenship, including political participation. Political elites perceive indigenous and rural populations as electoral voters, offering broken promises. They don't understand that indigenous peasants have their own political platform of a struggle based on communal consensus approved in the assembly. A community assembly is the most democratic institution that prevails locally. These local institutions has historically sustained peasant and indigenous mobilization for their social and political rights. Based on their own Andean knowledge system and cultural practices, including solidarity, reciprocity, and identity belonging to a community, territory, or ethnic nations. Rural and urban community members donated a little of their poor salaries and supplies resources to support these demonstrations, and the people who have mobilized to Lima to make their voices listened to in protest against a repressive regime. The government alleged that drug trafficking and illegal mining criminal organizations financed these mobilizations. In reactions, Aymaras and Quechuas made clear their self-managed community support. As an indigenous woman from Puno region said in Quechua, after the massacre of 17 civilians on January 9, Mananyu haikuja pagas hachuk puriku, dirichuikuta respeta chinaikum purischaiku. The word dirichuikuta, which means our rights, is the most powerful used in her speech during the massive mobilization of Aymara people taking several buses to Lima to struggle for justice and for the demand. By saying dirichuikuta, she claims her right to protest and stress their political rights, as she continues declaring, quote, "We ourselves are going on our own. No one is financing us. We will make ourselves respected and that they listen to our voices. We are not going to allow ourselves to be trampled like in the past. That is why we are fighting for our rights. Who is paying me? No one pays me. We ourselves are traveling organized, abandoning our children all because of this government. We are all one just for this cause. We are all going to live or we are all going to die, and we will all come to fight. We are traveling to enforce our rights, traveling with all our brothers and sisters," unquote. In Peru, indigenous men and women do not have the rights to make politics. If they protest, it is because radical political actors manipulated and mobilized them. This paternalistic and racist vision of the elite shows their incapacity for understanding indigenous community politics. The worst part of this vision is that these privileged sectors denigrated those protesters, passing a law to criminalize them as terrorists, linking them with the Maoist shining path terrorism. Dictatorial regimes under Alberto Fujimori in the 1990s and Dina Boluarte today criminalize protests with brutal repressions, arbitrary detentions, and killings, and torturing and imprisoning grassroots leaders with the same anti-communist paranoia, using the shadow of the shining path. Having said that, I'm now moving from structural violence to the second point, which is about the human rights violations. That's some points that already Myriam has mentioned at the beginning of this panel. But I particularly want to highlight how the government embraces indiscriminate violence and repressions as its primary form of rule handling disturbances without prudence, without dialogue, and without respecting for human rights. The massacre in Ayacucho and Juliaca proved such brutal state violence, according to the report of human rights organizations, including Amnesty International. These Andean regions like Ayacucho had already been devastated by the 1980s and the 1990s internal armed conflict between the Shining Path and the government security forces, causing about 70,000 fatalities, mainly indigenous Quechua-speaking people, such as from Ayacucho. In this region, Ayacucho, state violence against protesters today was a terrifying and traumatic reproduction of the 1980s counterinsurgent military occupations. The civilians who had survived that era of conflict and violence evoke that era with traumatic experiences. Forensic evidence and the footage captured during the December 15 protest last year resulted in 10 civilians killed, including minors, all indigenous Quechua descendants. It was a random killing, soldiers shooting directly at the bodies of the protesters. A similar dynamic happened in the city of Juliaca on January 9, where the protest prosecutor verified the cause of the death of 17 people and confirmed that all the victims died from gunshot bullets used by the army. This is why the Andean people say today, we are not longer living in democracy. A democratic nation didn't resolve internal social conflicts by arbitrarily killing civilians and protests. And so popular social sectors are again experiencing an increasingly authoritarian regimes today. The extrajudicial killings in Ayacucho and in Juliaca, and the arbitrary intervention at the San Marcos University in Lima that Myriam was showing us, where the protesters from the provinces were hosted, detaining and hundreds of protesters with violent, racist, misogynist discourses and actions. All of these human rights abuses demonstrate state terrorism, supported by the right-wing sectors and the mainstream media who defended their privileged interests. However, ironically, we see today how these privileged sectors discredit protesters, stigmatizing them as terrucos, a colloquial stigma for terrorists. Anyone could be suspicious within this dominant narrative as it was in the past during the internal armed conflict. And I'm going to talk a little bit on my own experience coming from the region of Ayacucho. This is the case of my family as we escaped from Ayacucho to take refuge in informal settlements and shanty towns in Lima in the early 1990s. Lima's well-off residents call us and branded us as terrucos because we came from Ayacucho, the birthplace of the Shining Path. So being Ayacuchano at this time was a perfect label, an insult, and a stigma and justifications to eradicate our existence from society and our identity as a Peruvian. And obviously, this is a stigma is supported by intimidating racial discriminations and social exclusions. This is the danger of this word terruco that we are seeing every day in Peru. When people call you like a terruco today, it's because they don't have an argument to debate with you. They don't listen to you. They don't dialogue with you. For them, calling you a terrorist or terruco, subversive, vandal, or criminal is a way to justify verbal and physical violence, racist discrimination, to destroy you, to disappear from that privileged life and ultimately kill you. Conservative elites, right-wing politicians, journalists, and business elites will approve of that narrative and ensure you are a terrorist and impersonate. And we are seeing today that how the corporate media, the government, and the conservatives stigmatize sectors of the Peruvian populations, including defenders of human rights, relatives of those detained and other victims of political violence, and in general, persons of indigenous origins become suspicious of terrorism. In the end, there is a continuity of state violence and terrorism today. The authoritarian politics of ruling the country by military and police repression is notorious today. And anyone critical of what we see and living under authoritarian regime can be subject to terruqueo, regardless of class or ethnicity. I know I don't have more time, but a final point I want to mention is about the anti-indigenous racism that intensifies state violence and military and police repression today. I want to quote an elderly indigenous woman who survived 20 years of violence in Ayacucho. She went to the protest after the massacre of 10 civilians by the military, and she spoke in Quechua. Here I'm going to translate to English. She said, quote, "Gentlemen, journalists, we are protesting in peace. We are not animals." So in this way, this woman, Dina Boluarte, ordered the military to kill us like dogs. Look, how many of us are injured? Look, how many dead? Gentlemen, journalists, look at the other women, mothers, how they cry inconsolable. Is this woman, Dina Boluarte, happy and calm with this? Is this fair for her? We are not animals to be murdered in this way. These murdered people have parents, siblings, children, and families. Doesn't she, Dina Boluarte, feel that? Doesn't it hurt her? What will happen if your family was killed? Will she be calm? Mr. Prosecutor, Ombudsman, Public Minister, where are they? We want peace and tranquility. We do not accept what they do to us, killing us like animals. We have marched peacefully with this banner, and she's showing at the banner, which says, Ayacucho is not terrorist, new constitutions. They have threw their gas cans and fired bullets at us, unquote. What I wanted to say, bringing this quote, it's how indigenous women constantly being despised, because their indigeneity, because this racism ideology that's continuing and denying, their political rights to be part of this Peruvian nations and part of this, to enjoy their citizenship. So the fullest citizenship, because they're always being considered as second citizens that with limited citizenship. So, and how they have been killed, as this woman say, like animals, who do not have like human rights or not be treated like humans. Thank you.
So thank you to all of our presenters for helping us understand this moment. Let me ask if there are questions in the audience. We have about half an hour or so left, right? A little bit more than that. If there are questions, we'll take them now. Yes.
What is going to be the outcome of this? I mean, when Merino became president and 2 students got killed in Lima, he lasted for what, 6 days? And now we have all these people dead and all these people injured. And now the feeling in Lima is that Boluarte and Congress are going to stay all the way to 2026. I mean, and sort of the policy is sort of easing. Is it going to remain there? Is it stable instability? What is going to happen, sort of?
Anybody want to be brave enough to try to answer that question?
Well, let me say a couple of things. I think that the problem is that concerns me is the beyond the elites of Lima. I mean, the how the these discourses that have seem to be unburied from the early times of the Cold War are filtering into other sectors of society. And as much as I am surprised by the level and the scope of the protest, I am surprised by the quickness in which the common sense that staying until 2026 had pervaded the public opinion because of the perception that this is the only way to instill stability to the country. So as much as this was, I don't know if it is okay to speak in past tense, but as much as this was an opportunity for expanding and giving a wider social basis to the system of domination in Peru, it has been strengthening, a reinforcement of a very anti-indigenous, anti-rural, centralist viewpoint. I'm not optimistic at all, and I would see that in the absence of political center, and with a left in ruins, some sort of authoritarian alternative is the one that is going to grow in the next years. And it seems that they are coming out with their the right is coming out with the agenda of surviving, of dealing with this furor, and there is a passive consensus in many, and I have felt that through family links. I mean, my family doesn't belong at all to the elites, and they are, totally against what I say about about my position, and they had sent me messages saying, "Shut up," basically. So that's the situation that I am afraid of.
Yeah, if I can interject, I mean, I also am not very optimistic because although, yes, this violence seems like a point of rupture, I actually think you actually can see a continuity that's been building over time, which goes back to, I said, this notion of the government exists not to represent, but to govern. And going back to Alan Garcia's government and the massacre of Bagua, right, in which used the same, the indigenous people block a road because they didn't like the development. They're massacred by the police with very little repercussions for the politicians that sent them there or the police that did it. The Merino government did massive detentions without habeas corpus, also killed 2 people, no repercussions. The Humala government had, the highest rates in Latin America of confrontations between police and civilians. It wasn't a national level, but it was a mining project here and there. So, and even the Castillo government, there was massive protests in 2022 in Huancayo, which were massive, also resulted in death with no repercussions. So in many ways, we've seen this pattern building over time, and it's just kind of accelerated and also been more racialized over time. And I think it is. Professor Rénique raises a very good point, is that yes, this is an elite kind of started discourse, but we also have to unfortunately acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of the urban middle class of Peru, not just in Lima. It's also worth noting, like the north of Peru has really not bought into this too much. Also have bought into this poner orden, calle compra, shut up and buy, things are fine. The macroeconomics are fine. And so I almost do see this kind of hybrid, like civic military, not military, but kind of civic police kind of hybrid moving forward, right? In a strange way. One of the strange and this is my last point. And I'll be one of the strange. I don't think I've ever. I really want to be careful here how this comes across. But one of the strange positive achievements of Fujimori, if I can even say that, was he actually put civilian control over the armed forces. Now he did it for all the wrong reasons because he wanted to control them for his personal politics. But one legacy is now kind of the military. I don't sense that they really want to take over government because they really got burned with Fujimori. And I think you kind of see this strange hybrid of finding willing civilian kind of leaders, but that then but still act, in this kind of put order. And part of this, because so many institutions have been carved out, right? Many Peruvians do not have, the only way to express opposition to the state is to protest, and the only way for the state to respond is with repression. And especially when this gets fused with existing long-term racism against Andean people and people in the Amazon, it just creates this really toxic mixture. So that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, one and all. I wanted to ask Ms. Nacimento, if she's still there, you're there. And the rest of you, if you have followed the coverage about Peru at the moment in the New York Times and the Washington Post. I'm not talking about the Lehmanian papers at the moment, which I read a little bit. But what is your opinion, Ms. Nacimento, of the coverage, mainly in the New York Times and the Washington Post about Peru?
I personally think international media has been more accurate in reflecting the violence that Peruvian people have been experiencing over the past 2 months. That, in comparison with the national media, is much better. That's all I have to say about it, because yeah, I definitely have read articles in the New York Times, and I think they have put a stress on repression and violence, which compared to, as I mentioned, to the national media, is at least something. It may not be that critical, but at least it makes a difference. I don't know if the others want to add more on this.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else wanted to
Well,
comment
I would
on
like to
that?
add at least one thing. I had the opportunity to talk to the head of the Andean Bureau of the New York Times, and it caught my attention, the fact that she asked me, what the hell means autoconvocados? And I asked, why? Well, because that is the most persistent word in all the talks that I have had with people in Puno, right? Because everybody was saying, we are autoconvocados, which is another word for the local lexicon, Peruvian political lexicon, right? Which is very, very interesting. And nothing like that. And I'm sorry to fall down into these commonplaces, but I think it's something that we all see, right? Understanding the dynamics that is going on in Peru, as my friends here have emphasized, and Miryam also, is not so difficult. Where the side of justice is.
Yep, right. Another question, what's the status of airports right now? Specific, this is a very selfish question, thinking of going to Peru, and there were protests in airports, especially the one I'm interested in right now is the one in Lima, and I wonder what the situation is right now.
Could I jump in here for just 1 second, Fortuna? Because Renzo, I think you wanted to chime in before on the previous question, and then we'll get to the airport question because it's an important one.
John, I also have a question from the
Okay.
I just want to add what José Luis bring the word autoconvocados, which shows also how this protest is something new, something different from previous protests we have been seeing, because this time we don't have like national leaders. and always like a political scientist or penologist saying that where is this, who is leading this movement, who is this president going to dialogue like that. So we see now kind of grassroots leaders emerging, from community level or from these gremios, this kind of unionized sectors across the country. And so every organization, of course, all these sectors have their own agenda, their political agenda, and maybe working, coordinating to bring the same platform. But at the same time, they are trying to autoconvocándose, right? To make it, their voice, listening to. I think this is something I'm very much proud that something new is coming, that the local, more community level grassroots leaders are being participating and leading, their own political platform to bring to the national level. And I want to say, just going to the first question for example, even that my colleagues feel like a little bit disappointed, but I want to be more positive that these civilian dissidents, from human rights organizations, from grassroots community levels, they will keep, being vigilant and going to protest, come to the street and plaza. And I'm very, kind of positive in the way that we need to be in that, path, as we are seeing increasingly authoritarian regime now. And it's not only that we are turning to hybrid authoritarian and democratic system. We are already in that, I think Financial Times already put us in that level, right? The hybrid system and the civic military regime. So I think this is time, perhaps, from, those who are very much conscious and progressive democratic people, we need to be vigilant and be part of, to make, resist and question, criticize what is going on right now, especially the human rights abuses. Thank you.
Now, please go to the airport. Yes. Thanks, Renzo. To the airports we go. Miryam, do you have anything to add on the airports? Anything to tell us about the airports?
It's my understanding that everything is working well at this point. Yeah, so Lima Airport, and I think most of the internal airports in Peru are working normally at this point.
Can I jump in here for a second? Because I think the airport question, obviously it's very important, but I think that, I mean, we have an expert here on the history of Machu Picchu. It seemed to me that a lot of the international coverage, at least in the US early on, focused on the fact that Machu Picchu was closed, that there was this moment of extraction of tourists, right? And I'm wondering what the impact was, or how much attention the government paid to reopening Machu Picchu as a way of returning to some sense of normalcy.
Well, I think those efforts start to become pessimistic again. Kind of the government's blindness to this, because they're the government is well, we need to reopen tourism, and they don't realize tourists aren't staying away because of protests. They're staying away because of these images of police killing people, right? It's France has tourist sites in France get blocked every month due to general strikes, and no one stops going to France. They keep on misreading this whole well, we need to use force to restore tourism without realizing that the force is what keeps the tourism away in the first place. And I would say it reveals this larger problem, which Peru and this whole Marca Peru of the past 20 years, which has been so successful in many ways in marketing and promoting Peru, and I would, in many ways, doing very well in some ways. But you've reached a point where so much of Peru's appeal to the world is based on celebrating an indigenous heritage, but you can only do that to a certain point without listening to indigenous social demands. And then there's not this resolution. They have not realized that you can't sustain this anymore. That, especially the fact that so much of Peru's identity and tourism offering is selling the places of Cusco and Puno, and it's you can't have one without the other, right? You can't celebrate this indigenous heritage and bank your national identity on it to the world while not listening to those voices, right? We've reached a breaking point of that, right? And I think that's an interesting point is that if most Puneños and Cusqueños actually are not that, if you ask them, they are not that concerned with the loss of tourism, partly because also there's an accurate perception that the most lucrative tourism in these regions doesn't stay in it, right? Which is also true, but I mean.
Thanks. You got a question from the audience?
I'll just read this question from Facebook, the live stream. From Paulo Suarez, it's a difficult one. What are your thoughts on the relationship between the urban left in Lima and the Costa and the indigenous movements in the provincias? How has the relationship unfolded during this crisis in comparison to past conjunctures?
Well, that's one chapter in my last book is about that topic. I would remember one quotation of a sort of legendary leader of the left, of the urban left, as the question proposes. He said, we went to the countryside as revolutionary, and we ended up being advisors of the peasant movement. And that was what happened with the urban left until the time when Shining Path basically destroyed that dynamics, because it cornered the urban left or the so-called democratic left with, are you with the Guerra Popular or against the Guerra Popular, right? And in this context in which this left was destroyed and Shining Path was defeated, emerged a third force, which is this Peru Libre force that took everybody by surprise. It is a party led by a medical doctor trained in Cuba. It was very corrupt. Even the leader himself couldn't be the candidate because he had accusations of corruption. And curiously enough, he said in the document, the foundational documents of the party, that the real enemy of his movement was not the right, but what he calls the izquierda caviar, right? And that a cosmic clash was going to take place between them and the izquierda caviar. And they launched a candidacy of Pedro Castillo, who ended up playing a very ambiguous role in this whole process, more important in symbolic terms than in factual terms, because as a president he was a disaster and served to condemn the left who knows for how long time. So I would say, following what Renzo has said a few minutes ago, that this is a movement that is unique because it doesn't have leaders, because it doesn't go through the channels that had been organizing the relationship between peasant movements and politics in the last 20 or 30 years.
Renzo, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, can I add something a little? The first thing we have to say, either the right or center or the left political parties already today legitimize. They don't have legitimacy not for gaining supporters, as we have been seeing with the right kind of conservative left, maybe, the Peru Libre, that turns to be the more like extreme.
In social issues, they are very conservative.
Yeah, like abortions or gender issues, they're against all these things, and they are very much close with the right-wing sectors, right? So, yeah, perhaps I should bring a little bit the indigenous way of politics also, that sometimes goes in different way of the left, the classic traditional left groups or political groups that have been seeing peasants and or indigenous area peasants like as class struggle or class social divisions and not like seeing the indigenous, the ethnicity or indigeneity, right? And that's something that explains why, for example, Shining Path or other radical leftist groups filed in gaining peasant supports, because indigenous peasant support has their own, knowledge system, politics of, cultural practices that sometimes goes in different, not in the class struggle positions as leftist groups have been mobilizing or politicizing indigenous peasants. And of course, there is some connections and having support from regions like in Puno, and we haven't seen that, and many peasants leaders have even organized and with under the Confederación de Campesina, so they're having, part of this 1960s, 70s left movement that brings some peasant mobilization for their land distributions. But this is something that I think we should perhaps think about more. This how do the indigenous peasants now are trying to negotiate or support leftist political agenda, or they have something different agenda that's not in the way that how from Lima left political parties are trying to build. So thank you.
Yeah, I am still not clear. I'm not from Peru. I am from Latin America. I'm still not clear as to what the peasant movement wants right now. I don't have a clear understanding of what these protests are about. What are their goals? Why now? I mean, are they saying that the president is not legitimate? What are they looking for? I'm not clear on that. Somebody can clarify that for me, please.
Can I start? I think that the triggering factors of rural protests in Peru are the emperor is naked kind of effect, right? That is, everybody fighting for power on the top, so we need to do something about that. Secondly, the gross attempts to invalidate rural voting. That was a scandal. That was something that was practically a performance display by the Peruvian right, by these lawyers from private universities that propose some of the most outlandish arguments to disqualify.
Because I don't know. Are you saying there was voter fraud?
Yeah, the accusation, this is what happened. That's why you said that this is sort of a Trump kind of script, right? In the aftermath of the elections, the runoff of the Peruvian elections, there was an attempt to disqualify a number of voting centers that, in a way, that would have allowed to disqualify the whole election.
But Castillo still won.
Yes, but that fraud ended up empty-handed. I mean, there was no proof for that fraud. But the very fact that there was an attempt to disqualify the voting on these arguments that were so ridiculous, that were so insulting, and the fact that people from the districts that were targeted for disqualification came up with a document saying, this is my sign, this is myself. We have the same last name because this is our local reality, and so on, I think was a second point that was a second triggering factor. And the third one.
But they just started protesting now. They didn't protest. Did they protest?
No. Of course, there were protests, and more effective than protests. There were there was a mobilization to defend the vote. And those accusations were disqualified, right? And the third point is the Constitutional Assembly, the idea of a new pact, a new deal. And this is a more political aspect of the social protest. And this is what makes all these social protests so unique, that what we are seeing is a new connection between city and countryside that is emerging, that is coming into the surface and playing an active role in Peruvian politics. And this is something that challenged our view of peasant movements. This is not a regular peasant movements mobilizing for land or for water. Now, the political learning of the recent years had the big school for this political learning had been mining conflicts. Some of the most significant movements that have been taking place in the last 15, 20 years throughout the southern Peru Sierra have been conflicts around contamination of rivers, defense of the ecology. For instance, the Aymarazo that I talk about was because all of a sudden the government of Alan Garcia had had eliminated an article that required a social license for new mining concessions. And nobody knew. Okay, but you're going back. What are the goals? Well, precisely what I am saying. The president to resign because she's accused of being a killer, because she's responsible for the killing of more than 60 people, right? Secondly, Constituent Assembly, because the country needs a new deal, right? And for the Congress to go. This is basically, these three items are the ones that prevailed everywhere where you have social protest, right?
I know that Mark wanted to jump in here for just 1 second.
No, but I mean, but your question raises, I think, a key problem, and I think why I'm slightly pessimistic is I think Renzo has articulated that there is this really interesting local organization which has been occurring, but unfortunately I think it's remained rather local, and unfortunately over the past 40 years, the kind of vertical organizations that tie local organizations to centers of power have been very much carved out, which means that you have a protest against a mining company here or a mining project there, but that protest goes, it's either snuffed out, maybe they prevent the mining company from entering a mine, and there are these articulations of a new constitution, but even this is, there's some, Boluarte has to resign, but then there's questions over when the election should happen. There isn't a consensus that's so clear, and unfortunately there aren't political parties or institutions that connect this, that can articulate this for the long term. And I think that's the key long-term challenge for Peru, is to reestablish, and people smarter than me might have the answer, but these connections between local and national politics, which kind of have been carved out over the past 40 years, which means that you can have really wonderful, inspiring, collections and common kitchens, and people, it is very inspiring and heartbreaking to see people donate money to get on buses to go to Lima to fill the streets, but there's a limit to how long that can last as a sustained political movement. And unfortunately, I think the current leaders of Peru seeing that there aren't these stable long-term structures, are kind of waiting out the clock. They're using a combination of repression and waiting out the clock for eventually these protests to run out of energy, or eventually just kind of imprison enough people that they just become that's the calculated risk, I think, that the leadership has made right now, unfortunately.
For one more question, is that yes?
Thank you. Since we're talking about the actual concrete demands of the protesters, right? There is a sense when that if Boluarte were to resign and if, you know, new elections were to be called off, what happens then, right? So many people, including me, have the sense that, you know, a lot of things are not going to change just with the new elections, right? There's the other demand, which is the strongest one, and the thing that brings, to me at least, more the idea that something could change would be the Constitutional Assembly, right? The new constitution. So my question to you all is, if we can imagine, which I don't think is going to happen, but if we can imagine that Boluarte is going to resign and that the new elections are going to be called off, what are the dangers of that happening now without a new constitutional assembly, without a new constitution, you know, without that push for a big change?
I'll try to be a little bit positive for once. Is that there was a model. It ended up not being sustainable, but Martín Vizcarra kind of offered a certain model, which he kind of bypassed the traditional parties, and during his government, which was ultimately, unfortunately, torpedoed, so this might not be a sustainable thing, but he did govern with this coalition because he came out of as a regional governor, and he did govern Peru effectively, you know, for a while. Until his government kind of hit the rocks on COVID, which, you know, in many ways, a lot of governments would flounder on that. But he did govern with this kind of coalition between him as executive and regional governors and local actors. And that was kind of sustainable for a while, but I mean, it ultimately didn't, which gives a little hope that maybe, you know, the answers lie in, you know, regional governors and regional politics. I mean, that might be some hope. Yeah, and actually, the most clear articulations of demands, I actually have been coming from the regional governors, actually, who have kind of, you know, said, I mean, they've actually said, okay, this is what our people, so, I mean, so I'll try to be a little bit positive. I mean, there is a solution in which, you know, in Peru, for years, Peru is always, it's just always, you know, lip service. Oh yeah, we're going to listen to regions, empower regions, and it never happens. But, you know, maybe that's where the answer could be. You know, if there is a rethinking of political structures, it could be regions, because national political parties kind of used to be the farm system, particularly opera, right? It was kind of, even people would leave opera, but it was kind of this training ground, but it doesn't exist anymore. And so maybe it's regional politics, which are now the new training grounds for effective representation. So there's some hope there, maybe, right? I mean, I don't know.
Any final words, Renzo, José Luis?
Well, at least we will have maybe 7 or 8 presidents in the last 5-6 years. So, but yeah, I want to keep it positive, optimistic also, because I think this is the way that maybe we are keeping the democracy and not just allowing this regime that, as we are seeing, not only committing human rights abuses, but also promoting impunity. That's so dangerous, because anyone can be, you know, imprisoned, detained, and be prosecuted with false accusations. And so that's reminding, you know, as we experienced in the 1990s authoritarian Fujimori regimes.
I don't want to portray it like I don't think that there should be elections now. I'm thinking about, you know, what is really going to change if further demands of change, like the Constitution, are not the immediate goal now, but more just, but we start just with the election, right? What, because who's going to take advantage of the chaos of a new election now? ECO,
General Chiabra.
And Nauro, right? Who's gonna profit from?
Okay, this is my view is that Antauro is out of game. Yeah, he's out, definitely. That a lot depends on Fujimorismo, which has been a main actor in Peruvian politics. I mean, the alliances they do. And on the other hand, there is a tendency that I don't think is exhausted yet, which is that anybody who competes with Keiko in the runoff will win, right? However, after the experience of Pedro Castillo, maybe more criticism is going to come up. So imagining something like a united left choosing a transitional figure or somebody who is more center left would be my utopia. But nobody talk in Peru. I mean, the sectors, the polarization is overwhelming. So I remember how bad Vergara did when he proposed a center as a political center, right? And it's interesting because liberals such as Alberto, who had a very fine handling of state politics, have difficulty to incorporate, all these regional forces. Because if there would be something positive in this situation, is that now we are talking about national politics, right? The scenario has been amplified drastically. And this is in a way a concretion of the voting for the illiterate, of the exhaustion of mendicant public policies, that as Myriam and you mentioned, that what the central power wants is people who ask questions, right? As opposed to real citizenship, right? Maybe, because there is this phrase that is always repeated in Peru, Dios es peruano, maybe we made a sudden turn and something marvelous happened. San Martín de Porras, Santa Rosa de Lima are Peruvians. You have to remember that. So maybe something of that sort happens, but it is very difficult to read the current scenario, right? Liberals are very disoriented. Urban leftists are in the same situation. There are no political parties. So probably what you are going to have is a competition of big figures. I was listening as I was coming here that Hernando de Soto is talking about being the articulator of a position. I heard the alcalde de Lima saying that he is not from the right, that he is from the center. Everybody is center now. Yes. But they're already moving their features, right? Yes. So we have to wait to see what.
So it's Lent and the Lord moves in mysterious ways. So maybe we'll get a resolution.
Exactly.
On that note, I wanted to thank you all. I wanted to thank our panelists for being here and really sparking a conversation about a country that's enormously important to Latin America and to us here at the Graduate Center. To Myriam, thank you so much for hanging out with us from Lima. We're very proud of you as a GC doctoral student, so keep up the good work and report when you come back home. And to you all, thank you for coming and spending 2 hours with us. The CLACLS is your home. Please keep up with what we're doing on social media. Andreina works very hard to put all of our events up there, and we expect to see you here for the remainder of the academic year. Thanks so much for being with. Be well.
Sí, el jueves.